I am Ann Perkins, another member of the Green Sanctuary Committee. In the summer of 2018, I became involved in campaigning for Joe Comerford to replace our UUSA friend, Stan Rosenberg, in the Massachusetts Senate. I only knew Joe by her fine reputation at the time. My admiration for and confidence in her has only increased since then. Joe has lived and worked in Western Massachusetts since the late 1990s, arriving fresh out of New York City's Hunter College School of Social Work, where she was focused on homelessness policy, prison reform, and earned an MSW. Once here, she led a number of programs, including the Western Massachusetts American Friends Service Committee, the Food Bank of Western Massachusetts, and the National Priorities Project, which garnered a Nobel Peace Prize nomination in Joe's final year. Joe was a campaign director for Move On when she decided to run for the Massachusetts Senate in a challenging write-in campaign, which she won. She currently serves on 6 Senate committees. She chairs both the Joint Committee on COVID-19 and Emergency Preparedness and Management, also the Joint Committee on Public Health, and she is the vice chair of the Joint Committee on Higher Education. She also serves on 3 more joint committees on the Environment, Natural Resources, and Agriculture, on mental health, substance use and recovery, and on racial equity, civil rights, and inclusion. Joe's wife, Ann, is a public school teacher. Joe and Ann have 2 children, both of whom attend Northampton Public Schools, where they live with their 2 dogs and 2 cats. I am delighted to introduce Senator Joe Comerford to speak with us this morning.
Thank you so much, Ann, for that beautiful introduction. My wife, Ann, and I say we are 2 moms, 2 kids, 2 cats, 2 dogs. It is wonderful to serve you in the Senate, and thank you so much for welcoming me here this morning. I'm delighted to join you in today's hope-filled Earth Day service in a virtual but no less beautiful green sanctuary, called by Amanda Gorman to dream a different reality, called by Mary Oliver to Blackwater Pond to live our lives. In the next 13 minutes or so, I want to talk about where we are as a Commonwealth as we leap into a new day of climate justice. But first, I want to thank you. Thank you for blocking big biomass from belching out toxins into the lungs of our children. Your social and political muscle, many of you, helped win that victory. Thank you for helping to power the next generation climate bill across the finish line. That's now law. Thank you for calling me to support the boldest, most effective climate bills filed this session, because even as we celebrate hard-won victories, we must go further. Let me start with biomass. On April 2nd, the state's Department of Environmental Protection wrote a letter revoking a conditional plan approval for an industrial scale biomass facility in Springfield. Here's an excerpt from the DEP. Quote, "The proposed facility is located in Springfield, which is an environmental justice community with many contaminated sites and sources of air and water pollution, particularly in areas where residents have elevated disease and health burdens." DEP's letter goes on to say, in addition, with COVID-19 rates particularly high in Springfield, there is an increased concern given multiple studies establishing the relationship between low income and communities of color with elevated air pollution levels and increased severity of disease and or mortality. End quote. Dr. Frank Robinson, who is the Vice President of Public Health at Bay State, did mapping during the pandemic that showed incidences of high COVID-19 infection rates and case clusters in Springfield. He showed that these elevated rates and case clusters could be overlaid, and it was almost a mirror image on the mapping Dr. Robinson has done for years, tracking income and housing and environmentally related health inequities in Springfield. Dr. Robinson has long understood what DEP has now acknowledged in this letter, that roads approved by the Mass Department of Transportation, buildings designed by the state's building codes, housing stock available with state vouchers, biomass facilities, all of these things affect a person's environment and thus their health. Thanks to the people gathered here today in today's service, this crucial understanding around environmental justice was also part of what propelled the recent big policy leap in the form of the Next Gen climate legislation. By requiring that the Commonwealth Stretch Building Code, the code that 176 cities and towns have chosen to require greener buildings, be upgraded to a net zero building code and be designed by the end of next year, a step toward addressing emissions from buildings and one led by Amherst. By passing the healthy soils legislation that I filed, and by including language my team added in the new climate law, tracking carbon sequestration from natural and working lands, to recognize the full benefit of our Earth, the benefit our Earth provides every day in the fight against climate change, a recognition that our trees, our riverbeds, farms have a critical role to play alongside green energy. By codifying a definition of environmental justice into law to ensure further rulings like the DEP ruling on biomass, a necessary step toward grappling with environmental racism. None of these ideas were conceived yesterday, as you know. What we see in the final legislation or plan revocation when it comes to biomass is the culmination of decades-long efforts. It takes research, it takes organizing, it takes a willingness to see a legislative opening, even when it's a very narrow opening, and then follow through after the bills are passed into law or letters written, watchdogging the implementation. There's a lot of work to do in that bucket. We'll call it the watchdogging work. And it's not enough to pass a good policy or make a good decision. We have to see them through. So where should we focus this session? I'll just offer three quick buckets of work. Number one, implementing the climate law and all of the things that come with it. Getting to net zero emissions by 2050 will require millions of homes and vehicles to eliminate their use of fossil fuels. The law establishes a number of deadlines that will soon be upon us. By this summer, the law requires emissions reduction targets for programs sponsored by MassSave for home energy efficiency. By next summer, the law requires specific statewide emission limits for 2025. And by the end of next year, we must see the new net zero energy stretch code. Number two, we also must continue to pursue bold climate change legislation this session, and with, of course, a Biden-Harris administration in office now in Washington. There are new bills that have been filed this session, and issues remain to be tackled. For example, I'm supporting legislation that sets up a carbon tax in the Commonwealth with funds going toward green infrastructure and rebates to consumers most in need. I filed legislation to make rooftop solar more accessible to those who rent, or to overhaul our energy grid, which was woefully in need of that overhaul, and to conduct green energy retrofitting of our schools by 2050. The legislature's Zero Waste Caucus is also very active this season, supporting bills on producer responsibility, funding for municipal recycling, and plastic waste bans. When it comes to the waste that goes into our environment, we must go all in to fight toxic PFAS chemicals and aerial spraying of pesticides, and to ensure that our farmers have the resources they need to farm without toxic herbicides. This Earth Day, let's commit to ridding these toxic chemicals from our environment. We know this needs to be done responsibly. Let's get it done by Earth Day 2022. And number three, finally back to biomass. I started by celebrating the people-powered win on biomass, but we still have a fight before us because biomass is still listed as renewable energy. The Baker administration still has the ability to create new state subsidies for biomass. Our vigilance related to legislation which has been filed and executive action will be critical. A few weeks ago, I invited the prophetic Dr. Sandro Gallia, Dean of Boston University School of Public Health, to brief the legislature on preparing for the next contagion, the next disaster. I know that sounds grim, but I watched Dr. Gallia's presentation to the National Institute of Health, and I found it so provoking. I wanted my colleagues to hear directly from him. Dr. Gallia's presentation laid bare the brutal inequities present long before COVID-19 ravaged our Commonwealth and the nation. He told us that we all should have expected nothing less than increased contagion, illness, and death in poor communities and communities of color, given generational disparities and social health indicator inequities. But then he took it one step further and said that unless we're willing to change the status quo dramatically and immediately, we should just save ourselves the time and expense and write the chapter for the next contagion right now, because nothing short of a complete reversal of our current direction will be enough to right our current wrongs. Among the top issues Dr. Gallia, like Dr. Robinson, who I referenced earlier, called us to attend to was climate justice, environmental racism. And so I'll leave my remarks here at the intersection of Earth Day and public health and economic justice and racial justice, and the promise that together we can build back better, bolder, more justly after COVID-19 on this new day. Thank you so much for this opportunity to speak with you.